We are now at the decade of 1950 in our history. In the United States, this is a decade when there were rising concerns about communism, and it was a decade when there was the beginning of a Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. Recall that after the revolution in Russia, way back during the very First World War, at that time, the Bolsheviks took control and they established a communist government that would become the Soviet Union. So then in the 1920s, a man named Joseph Stalin became premier of the Soviet Union, and he established totalitarian rule. He maintained control by use of a secret police, and people who were suspected of disloyalty to his Communist Party could be arrested and sent to labor camps, or even sentenced to death. Also recall that in World War II, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, and the war with Germany ended when the Soviet army reached the city of Berlin and Hitler committed suicide. So during World War II, the Soviet Union was part of an alliance with the United States and Britain. All three countries were trying to defeat Germany. However, it was an uneasy alliance. The United States was hesitant to trust the Soviet Union and hesitant to trust Stalin. A picture of leaders from all three countries at the end of the war is depicted on the screen. So then, after the war, the Soviet Union sought to maintain power over the countries where its army had established control during the war, and the Soviet Union took control over much of Eastern Europe. Then, in 1949, the Soviet Union developed their own atomic bomb. So, shortly after World War II, the Soviet Union went from being an uneasy ally to being viewed as an enemy. People were concerned about its totalitarian communist government. They were concerned about Stalin's agenda to establish control over multiple countries. They were concerned about the fact that the Soviet Union developed their own nuclear weapons. They were worried that Stalin might turn out to be another Hitler, and they were worried he might launch a nuclear attack on the United States, and they were worried about the spread of communism throughout the world. So this created a military arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union, an arms race that would be called the Cold War, with each country wanting to make sure it had the most powerful military and the most powerful nuclear bombs. The picture on the lower left of the screen is from a test of a hydrogen bomb that was developed by the United States, and it was even more powerful than the bombs dropped on Japan. In the United States, this also created a fear of communism that politicians used to gain political advantage. Joe McCarthy was a senator who became well known for accusing people of being communists. He held Senate hearings, and he accused other politicians, and he accused employees of the State Department, and he accused many other people of being communists, or he accused them of being spies for the Soviet Union. And in Hollywood, actors accused of having communist sympathies were placed on a blacklist. And once they were placed on this blacklist, that would make them unable to gain any further acting work. And there was a concern that universities might have professors who had communist sympathies and who might then corrupt their students. So, in California, all faculty at public universities were required to sign loyalty oaths, to sign an oath saying they were loyal to the United States and that they were not communists. And at this time, people accused of being communists, they were often called pink. And many years before he became president in the 1950s, Richard Nixon was elected to the United States Senate. And as part of his campaign, he had a female opponent, and as part of his campaign against her, he accused her of being, quote, pink down to her underwear. And 1950 is the year that the Korean War began. a war that was driven by this fear of communism. So Korea was an area that had been controlled by Japan for several decades. At the end of World War II, after the Japanese surrender, the status of Korea was that the Soviet Union controlled the north part of the country and the United States controlled the south part. So the Soviet Union established a communist government in the north, and the United States established a democratic government in the south. Also, after World War II, there was a revolution in China, and in 1949, a communist leader named Mao Zedong declared the creation of the People's Republic of China. So now, both the Soviet Union and China were communist countries. And this placed the communist North Korea in a strong position because it had the support of both the Soviet Union and China. In addition, the communist leaders in North Korea did not think that the United States was highly invested in South Korea, and they did not think that the United States would really want to defend South Korea if it was attacked. So, North Korea invaded South Korea in hopes of unifying the entire country under communist rule. However, in the United States, people recalled how early failures to act against Hitler's aggression only encouraged more aggression, and they were worried about the spread of communism. And so the United States believed it was necessary to act, and the United States engaged in a war against North Korea to defend South Korea. And the picture on the screen is from the Korean War. And as can be seen, some of the fighting occurred in places where it was bitterly cold. And so after about 3 years of fighting, at that point, each side controlled about the same area as it did before the war started. And at that point, a ceasefire was established. It was established in 1953. And notably, this ceasefire was never followed by an official treaty between the countries. So technically, there has not been a formal end to this war. The decade of 1950 is when television becomes popular in the United States. During the previous decade, only a handful of people owned television sets. And then at the beginning of the 1950s, around 20% of households had a television. And then by the end of this decade, about 90% would have a television. Some of the most popular shows included variety shows like the Texaco Star Theater, and game shows like The Price is Right, and westerns like Gunsmoke, and situation comedies like The Honeymooners, and programs for children like Leave It to Beaver and The Mickey Mouse Club. Pictures from some of these shows are on the screen. And one notable thing about these pictures is that in these pictures, all the actors are white. The decade of 1950 is also when rock and roll music became popular. And in considering the history of popular music in the United States, it's important to think about the issue of cultural appropriation. That is, it's important to consider the complex question about when it is good and when it is bad for people of one culture to use or enjoy things from another culture. Sometimes people adopt things from other cultures in ways that value diversity, in ways that increase inclusion and respect and appreciation of all people from all cultures. And certainly it seems to me that this is a good thing. However, it's also possible for people to adopt things from other cultures in a manner that ignores or exacerbates a power differential between the two cultures. And this is a type of cultural appropriation that can be harmful. So Chuck Berry, who's depicted on the right-hand side of your screen, Chuck Berry, he was a black musician who drew from an African-American musical tradition. Specifically, he drew from a style of music that could be called rhythm and blues. And Chuck Berry is the person most directly responsible for creating the new distinctive sound of rock and roll music. Now, Elvis Presley, he's depicted on the left-hand side of your screen, and Elvis Presley was a white musician who was skilled at playing this style of music, and who became much more famous than any black musician. Now, the person who discovered Elvis was a white man named Sam Phillips, and Sam Phillips founded a record company called Sun Records, and at his studio he often recorded black musicians. However, he was especially interested in trying to find white musicians that could play songs in the same style as the black musicians he was recording. He correctly believed he could make a lot of money at this, because he thought that white audiences could enjoy this style of music, but that white people would find it more acceptable, and they would be more likely to buy records if the music was played by white musicians. And so Sam Phillips discovered that Elvis Presley could do this. And indeed, Elvis Presley became quite famous, and he made a lot of money. So what this means is that rock and roll music was based on styles of music developed within black culture. However, in the music industry, the production and marketing of rock and roll music was dominated by white performers. Although Chuck Berry was famous, he was nowhere near as famous, and he did not make near as much money as Elvis Presley or some of the other white rock stars. This meant that white people were getting rich from material they appropriated from black culture. It meant that white audiences were giving credit to white musicians for innovating a style of music that, in fact, had its origins in black culture. Notably, although Elvis Presley made a lot of money by playing rock music, he clearly gave credit to black culture as the source of his music. He was exposed to music of black musicians when he was growing up, and this was simply a style of music he particularly enjoyed playing. And when people tried to congratulate Elvis for inventing a new style of music, he would correct them, and he would give credit to the black musicians who were the real inventors of the new style. So he gave credit to black musicians, but certainly he also benefited from his privilege as a white performer. The decade of 1950 also included several events that would be the beginnings of a civil rights movement. This is a movement that would become much larger in the 1960s, but it had its beginnings, its roots in the 1950s. And one event that helped to spark the civil rights movement was the murder of Emmett Till in 1955. So Emmett Till was a 14-year-old African-American boy from Chicago, and he's depicted here on the screen in a picture with his mother. And Emmett Till went to Mississippi to visit some of his family there, and one day while he was in Mississippi, he went to a local store with some other teenagers to buy candy. And it's impossible to know what exactly happened in the store, but the person running the store was a white woman who owned the store with her husband. And she thought that Emmett Till failed to follow the rules for how a black boy was supposed to behave toward a white woman. Some reports are that maybe Emmett whistled. Maybe he just whistled, or maybe he whistled at her, or maybe he just said something to her. We don't know exactly what happened, but regardless of what happened, this turned into a story, and the story eventually reached the woman's husband. So, a few days later, two white men, it was the woman's husband and one of his friends, they show up, they find Emmett Till, and they kidnap him, and they take him to a place where they brutally beat him and then kill him, and then they dump his mutilated body in a river. Now, eventually, the body was discovered and recovered, and the two men were charged with the crime. However, they were quickly found to be not guilty by an all-white jury. Then later, having been acquitted of the crime and safe from further prosecution, they admitted to killing Emmett, and they even made money by selling their story in which they described how they killed him. Now, although this type of murder is something that was certainly relatively common in the United States at this time, for some reason, this particular murder received a degree of publicity. This particular murder just happened to be the one that got the media attention. Part of the reason may have been because Emmett was from the North, where there were black newspapers and black magazines that could publish the story. Part of it may have been because his mother decided to have an open casket funeral in Chicago, where thousands attended and thousands of people saw the degree to which his body had been badly mutilated. And pictures were even published in the media. And this publicity added a spark of momentum to the beginnings of this civil rights movement. And it was also in 1955 that Rosa Parks inspired the Montgomery, Alabama bus boycott. At that time, many black people in Montgomery relied on the bus system for transportation, and the bus system relied on black riders to make a profit. And these buses were segregated. To ride a bus, a black person would first pay at the front of the bus, and then get off the bus, and then re-enter the bus through a back door, and then sit in the back of the bus and sit behind a sign that read colored section. The front of the bus was reserved for white passengers, and if this section got full, the bus driver would move the colored section sign back to enlarge the section for white people. At this point, black people were expected to get out of their seats and move further back on the bus. So, on December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks was riding home on a bus from a long day of work at a department store. When the whites-only section became full, the bus driver moved the colored section sign back and asked her to give up her seat. But she refused to do so. So she was arrested and found guilty and charged a fine. And inspired by Rosa's resolve, the black community in Montgomery took action on plans to organize a large-scale bus boycott. One of the goals of this boycott was to end segregated buses. And this boycott required a tremendous amount of organization by the African American people of Montgomery. They had to arrange alternate transportation and maintain the boycott. So people walked, and they organized shared rides, and they were able to maintain this boycott for an entire year. And the boycott ended when the Supreme Court ruled that segregated buses were unconstitutional. And notably, one of the people that helped to lead this boycott was a young pastor from the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church, and his name was Martin Luther King. And in the picture, you see Rosa Parks and also Martin Luther King in the background. It was also during the decade of 1950 that the Supreme Court ruled against segregated schools. So Linda Brown was a 9-year-old girl living in Topeka, Kansas, and her family lived near an all-white school. But because Linda was black, she was forced to attend a school for black children that was much further away from her home and that received substantially less funding. On the screen is a picture of Linda walking by the white school that was near to her house. So Linda's father filed a lawsuit to allow Linda to attend the white school, and the NAACP represented the Browns, and their case, combined together with several other similar cases, made it to the Supreme Court. And in a ruling that has become known as the Brown versus Board of Education ruling of 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that separate schools could not be equal. The Supreme Court of the 1950s was led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, and this court was strikingly different from previous Supreme Courts in its support of civil rights. So this ruling was an important win in favor of civil rights. At the same time, this ruling was poorly enforced. In addition, this ruling actually provides another example of how easily racist ideas can seep in even when people are attempting to do good things. Because in writing the opinion for this unanimous decision, Chief Justice Warren said that the segregation of white and colored children in public schools, he said it has a detrimental effect on the colored children. Note that he did not say that it had a detrimental effect on white children, just that it had a detrimental effect on the colored children. This seems to imply that black children benefit by assimilating with white children and not vice versa. The ruling implies that black schools are inadequate because they are black, and not that black children would have adequate schools if the schools were given adequate resources. So, although the ruling was clearly a win for civil rights, the reasoning behind the decision could be viewed as racist, implicitly assuming white superiority. If you look at a typical introductory psychology textbook, it will probably cite some theories that were developed before the 1950s, but it will probably not discuss very many specific studies that were conducted before the 1950s. Some of the reason for this might be that, as we've seen, many advances in statistics and data analysis did not develop until the 1930s and the 1940s, and these techniques did not begin to be widely used until the 1950s. So, prior to the 1950s, researchers were mostly using approaches to data analysis that were problematic and that have since become obsolete. However, starting around the 1950s, researchers begin to conduct some psychology studies that will eventually go on to become classic studies. That is, studies that are still cited today in psychology textbooks. And one of these studies is the Solomon Asch line judgment conformity study. So in this study, a participant would be seated in a room with 7 other people, and the participant would be led to believe that the other people were also participants. In reality, the other people were Confederates, just pretending to be participants. And the group completed a series of trials where the group was shown a target line segment and asked to judge which of 3 options was the same length as the target line segment. And they were asked one by one to state their answer out loud. In each trial, one option was clearly the correct option. And in most of the trials, all the Confederates gave the same wrong answer before it was the participants' turn. And after hearing all the other group members state the same wrong answer, participants would often agree with the group and state the same wrong answer as everybody else, even though that answer was clearly wrong. And the pictures on the screen are pictures from the study. Now, One detail about this study that's often not mentioned in the textbooks is the lack of diversity in the sample. On the one hand, Solomon Asch actually went out of his way to collect data from students at 3 different colleges, specifically for the purpose of capturing 3 different socioeconomic groups. Yet, in spite of all the effort he made to collect data from an economically diverse sample, it's striking that his study only included people who were white, and it only included people who were male. There were no women, and there were no people of color in this study. And maybe the most important thing is that the publication provided no explanation for why the study needed to focus on this narrowly defined sample. This apparently was not viewed as an important thing to address in the publication at this time. And this seems to indicate an implicit type of racism and sexism in the psychology of the 1950s. In the decade of 1950, there was a revolutionary change in the treatment of people with severe types of mental illness, such as schizophrenia. The symptoms of schizophrenia can include having delusions and hallucinations, and it can be extremely debilitating. And we've seen in our history how people have tried many things for treating this type of mental illness. In the 1800s, they tried moral therapy and also bloodletting. More recently, they tried things like lobotomies and also interpersonal psychoanalysis. However, none of this was effective, and some of it was certainly harmful, and asylums, they simply grew larger and larger. However, in the 1950s, there was a major breakthrough in the discovery of a medication that actually had a reliable effect in reducing symptoms associated with schizophrenia. This was the beginning of the use of antipsychotic medication. And the first drug to be used was a drug called chlorpromazine, or with a trade name of Thorazine. And in research using valid assessment instruments and good experimental design, this drug was found to substantially reduce symptoms of schizophrenia. And so the introduction of antipsychotic medication would produce an exodus of patients out of asylums. So instead of locking people in asylums, they were given medication. And in many cases, certainly not all cases, but in many cases, this medication allowed people to function in society. Now, notably, the introduction of antipsychotic medication was not all good news. These medications often had severe side effects. Some of the side effects include involuntary body movements that are similar to symptoms of Parkinson's disease. This can include side effects such as tardive dyskinesia, which involves involuntary repetitive body movements, and akathisia, which involves a feeling of inner restlessness and an inability to stay still. Now let's consider the status of psychotherapy in the decade of 1950. Recall that clinical psychologists are now in the business of providing psychotherapy, And at this point, almost all psychotherapy is psychodynamic in nature. It all has ties to Freud's ideas, and it emphasizes the importance of unconscious drives and of childhood experience. Now, the one exception is that Carl Rogers was also proposing his own type of therapy that he called non-directive therapy. But now, during the decade of 1950, a few other approaches to psychotherapy begin to appear. And one of these new approaches is behavior therapy. And behavior therapy will be distinct from the other existing types of therapy in two ways. First, it will have a direct link to psychology because it will be based on ideas drawn from behaviorism. And behaviorism was the dominant psychological theory at the time. Second, it will emphasize the importance of using research to evaluate the effectiveness of treatment. And the story of behavior therapy begins with an important paper that was written by a psychologist named Hans Eysenck. And Eysenck was English, and he was actually on the faculty at University of London. That's that same place where all those statisticians were. And he is probably most famous for his theory of personality, in which he says that personality is defined by three dimensions that he called extroversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism. Notably, more recently, there has been some growing evidence that Eysenck may have faked some of his research results. People have analyzed the results that he published in some of his papers, and they've found patterns that would be highly improbable to occur unless results were being faked. However, the paper that's most important for our story right now is actually a review paper that he published. Specifically, in 1952, he published a literature review of all the existing reports that he could find of psychotherapy outcomes. And he concluded that psychotherapy is entirely worthless. That is, he claimed that the effect of psychotherapy does not exceed the spontaneous remission rate. Now, note that at this point, the dominant theory is psychodynamic, and so the majority of studies in his review would pertain to psychodynamic forms of therapy. Also, note that most studies he included in his review would have been similar to that Freeman lobotomy paper from the 1940s that we considered. Recall that the Freeman study reported levels of outcomes for people receiving treatment, but it did not make any comparisons between a treatment and a control group, and it just had physicians' ratings of the quality of the outcome of someone receiving treatment. So what Eysenck did is he attempted to compare outcomes from these published treatment studies with what he estimated outcomes would be for people with no treatment. And he concluded that the treatment outcomes as reported in the published studies were about the same as his estimated outcomes for people with no treatment. In other words, he concluded that psychotherapy has no effect. Now, this initial approach was really too crude to produce any kind of definitive results. But the important thing about the study is that it highlighted the need to conduct randomized clinical trials. There was a need to conduct research using the experimental methods described by Fisher and using random assignment and statistics such as p-values for addressing issues of sampling error. This would be the only way to determine whether psychotherapy was actually effective. So this study was like the opening shot that inspired a subsequent line of research testing the effectiveness of psychotherapy. Currently, many psychotherapists emphasize the importance of using empirically validated treatments. And this study was like the spark that lit the fire that eventually led to the current emphasis on empirically validated treatments. Now, another thing that happened with Eysenck's review is that it angered most of the psychoanalytically oriented therapists. They did not like being accused of being worthless. And this led to the formation of two competing philosophies in psychotherapy, with each side viewing the other with contempt. So one side followed Eysenck. This side questioned the effectiveness of psychodynamic approaches to therapy, and they sought to develop new approaches based on the psychological theory of behaviorism, and they emphasized the importance of testing their techniques using randomized clinical trials and conducting empirical research. And the people following this agenda developed a new approach to psychotherapy called behavior therapy. The other side included the psychodynamic therapist. This side claimed that psychotherapy was too complex to be studied in experimental research, that psychodynamic approaches could not be reduced to treatment manuals, and they thought behavior therapy failed to address the underlying unconscious factors that were the root causes of people's problems. One of the first people to follow this new agenda for behavior therapy and to develop a technique for psychotherapy was Joseph Wolpe. So Wolpe was a white psychiatrist from South Africa. And interestingly, although this new behavior therapy was closely connected with psychological theories of behaviorism, Wolpe was actually a psychiatrist and not a psychologist. So anyway, in 1958, he published results regarding a treatment that he developed for phobias that he called systematic desensitization. So to remove a phobia, people would first create a fear hierarchy of situations causing different levels of fear. For example, if someone had a fear of snakes, maybe mild fear might be caused by simply imagining a snake, and extreme fear might be caused by holding a snake. Then people would be taught to relax. They'd be taught how to use relaxation techniques. And then they would gradually work their way up their fear hierarchy while relaxing. The idea was that they would learn to pair the feared object with relaxation. Notably, although the behavior therapy movement would come to emphasize the importance of clinical trials, Wolpe's first published study simply provided several case examples. Nevertheless, Wolpe's systematic desensitization provided a starting point for the new behavior therapy movement. In addition to behavior therapy, there was also another type of psychotherapy that developed in the decade of 1950, and this other type of therapy was based on something called family systems theory. So family systems theory began with 3 white men who worked together in Palo Alto, California. They were involved in providing treatment to families that had a child with schizophrenia, and they formed somewhat of an interdisciplinary team of academics. So first, there was Gregory Bateson, and he was actually an anthropologist. And then there was Jay Haley, and he had a master's degree in communication. And finally, there was Don Jackson, and he was a psychiatrist. This group is sometimes referred to simply as the Palo Alto Group. Later, Don Jackson would establish a program called the Mental Research Institute, also located in Palo Alto, and this would become the source of many famous future family systems therapists. That is, many family systems therapists received their initial training in Palo Alto, California. Now, one of the key ideas promoted by this Palo Alto group in their family systems theory was the idea of homeostasis in families. So according to the idea of homeostasis, a family is a system that seeks to maintain a homeostatic balance, just like a thermostat in a house makes a furnace turn on and off to maintain a steady balance of temperature in the house. So according to their theory, families have implicit rules and established patterns of behavior that maintain this homeostatic balance. And if one person does something that upsets this balance, other family members will do things to pull the family back to the balance point. So from this perspective then, when one family member has symptoms of a mental disorder, the behavior is presumed to serve a function in maintaining a homeostatic balance in the family. For example, if a child is engaging in oppositional behavior, a family systems theorist would not conceptualize the child as having a problem, but instead this therapist would presume that the child's behavior is playing a role in maintaining a homeostatic balance within the family. So from a family systems perspective, the problem is located in the family system and not in the child. Family systems theorists, they often use the term identified patient, and they use this term to describe the person that the family has identified as having a problem. But their goal is to change the entire family system and not to treat the symptom of a single identified patient. For example, a family systems therapist might decide that a child's behavior problems could be the result of a mother who's abdicating her authority, which then allows her to become emotionally enmeshed with the child, which allows the father to be emotionally distant while maintaining the role of a family protector. And so, to treat the child's behavior problems from this perspective, a therapist might seek to disrupt an apparent family rule that family members must allow the father to be emotionally distant. And that might be their approach for treating the child's behavior problems. Another idea proposed by family systems theory is the idea of double bind communication. So a double bind is a situation where a family member is simultaneously given two opposite messages, and where there is a family rule that the discrepancy cannot be acknowledged or discussed. One of the classic examples that was given of a double bind situation was an example of a mother visiting her institutionalized son who had schizophrenia. And in this example, the mother asks her son for a hug, saying, "Aren't you going to give your mother a hug?" And the mother does this while using body language that is cool and distant. So the verbal message was to give the mother a hug, but the body language was that she did not really want a hug. And presumably, the family had a rule that it would not be okay for the child to comment or to say anything about the apparent contradiction. Unfortunately, like Frieda von Reichmann's concept of the schizophrenogenic mother, this concept was also sometimes used in a way that blamed parents for the mental illness in their children.